Welcome to Brain Hack number 9. So in this brain hack, our question is, what causes triggers anyway? This is a subject that I love. Getting back to the root of what drives consciousness is it's just really key. And so I seldom get a chance to really break it down the way I want. And so that's what I want to do today, is I want to break down actually what causes the trigger in a lot of detail today. And so that's going to be my goal for the day, is to get into the kind of detail that hopefully brings a lot of clarity to what's really causing the trigger. Because we want to blame the world for them, and that's not entirely wrong. But if we can understand them at a deeper level, then we don't have to feel subject to conditions. We don't have to feel like life is happening to us. So I'm going to go ahead and just dig in. So there's a lot of information I want to cover today in a short amount of time. I'm going to try and keep this to about 20 minutes. So to begin with, triggers. We're going to talk about where triggers begin. So what a trigger is, in a nutshell, is sensory information combined with memory. This creates a trigger that drives our consciousness. Now, you've probably heard me say this a lot, but I want to break it down. And the way I want to break it down is I want to begin with memory. So basically, memory is stored data. It's not the narrative we think it is. It's just information. So, for example, we know I like to talk about brownies. So the smell of brownies, within that is the smell itself. What the nose perceives is a memory. The scent is a memory. So smelling it is a memory. The taste of brownies is part of the memory. The sugar that is going into the brain, because the brain loves sugar, so that is a memory. Or we might be out at a restaurant we love, or having fun with friends when we have when we're having this brownie. So all of this data combines into a narrative, but each piece of the narrative is memory. So you might have an experience of eating a brownie with ice cream on it, and this becomes a new narrative. So the brain is using these bits of information. So, for example, you might have a candle that smells like a brownie, and that may make you feel happy, but you're not combining all those narratives. Now the narrative is, I have a candle, and the memory of how much I love brownies turns that into a smell or a scent that is pleasant for me to smell. So this sensory information combining with this is simple, but this is where people can sometimes confuse it. So sensory information is sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. It's also internal feeling, the internal experience we have, so the salient experience. So when we're talking sensory information, though, we are talking current moment, the data that the brain is receiving. So when you're talking about a brownie, you have this scent that is a memory. Then you have the current experience of the scent of a brownie, and it's triggering the memory of that scent. But the sensory piece of combining with the trigger of the memory is not the memory of the scent. It's the current experience. You might have a similar experience if you don't necessarily smell a brownie. It may be that you see a brownie, and maybe this is a brownie that you've had before, and it's a better brownie than other brownies, and you see it. So say it's in particular packaging or something, or you go to a specific restaurant and you're like, oh, I love their brownies. Now we're not using the scent. We're not using the sense of smell. We're now using the visual sense. We're using what we see, the restaurant, the way the brownie looks, all of this. So we need to remember that memory is combining with the current experience, the current sensory data that is coming into the body. So every single trigger in the brain begins with this sensory information. The brain is measuring everything constantly. So it could be temperature, or it could be humidity, or even like the barometric pressure. Even if you aren't aware of the sensory data, the brain is still reading it. For example, you might see a person that reminds you of somebody that you really liked in the past, or maybe someone you didn't like, and the familiarity of that person looking like the person you knew, the brain is reading that data. So the previously stored data is combining with the current sensory information. This is what's creating our trigger. So, for example, if you walk into a house where you smell brownies cooking, you might be happy. So you might be experiencing happiness because you remember the positive experience you've had with brownies in the past. In another situation, it might be, for example, the anniversary of the loss of a loved one that triggers sadness. This is commonly known that people during the anniversaries of traumatic events can experience a reliving of that event. Or, for example, the weather and the change in light might trigger seasonal depression for you. The brain is what's measuring this. You don't decide to be seasonally depressed. The brain feels that something happened during a specific season that caused something that was an unpleasant experience. And so when it experiences that season again, it experiences it as a depressed state. So our consciousness, in the end, we want to think of consciousness as how we currently experience the way we feel, the thoughts that are in our head, what we're thinking, how we're perceiving the world. And we need to connect the idea that this is all a result of that combination of the current sensory data along with the current sensory data along with memory. And it could be different combinations of memory. Brownies might relate to a lot of different experiences, or the weather. Seasonal depression can be something about holidays. And so even if you're in Jamaica and there's not the issue of light that you might experience in your hometown, if you don't live in Jamaica, but still, because maybe there are some people there that are celebrating the holidays, it returns anyway, because it's about more than just that. So in the class, Relief of Suffering, in the Relief of Suffering class, for those of you who don't know, that is available free on our website, inspiredevolutionproject.com, as well as on YouTube. It's the 9 class series that says 1 of 9, 2 of 9, etc. But anyway, there was a part of that class where I'm talking about the effects of triggers. And one of the things we need to realize, and not just blaming the external experience. So a lot of times, say our boss isn't treating us the way we think, and then we're angry. We're going to blame that anger on our boss not treating us well. Well, really, it's just how our brain processes the boss treating us that way. Because maybe somebody else doesn't respond to that boss in the same way. But what we want to understand is this doesn't make it our fault, because it's all happening subconsciously. But it's understanding. So, for example, if I'm in a negative trigger, and I'm in a space where I'm triggered and I'm not happy, I'm angry or frustrated or depressed. If someone tries to make me laugh while I'm in that state, it's worse. I get worse. It upsets me when people try to make me laugh if I'm upset, but that's not their fault and it's not the situation's fault. That's just a connection to my sensory data. When I'm upset, I want to be taken seriously, and laughter feels inappropriate. Or maybe I feel like I'm being chased by a tiger, and so this is not something to laugh about. Where in a different situation where I'm not triggered, and it could be a situation that looks similar, but I'm in a more positive state, it won't upset me if somebody tries to make me laugh out of it. I'll just think, oh, okay, well, they're trying to help. So in different moments, we may like or dislike different things. This happens a lot in relationships. The way we feel about a person in the beginning when we're all flooded with dopamine because of this new experience is different than we feel months later. And sometimes we may decide, wow, I was with someone, I was in this moment, and it felt like this is the person I'd be with forever. I mean, when we're teenagers or something and we meet someone, I'm going to be here forever. But then later it's kind of like, wow, what did I even see in that person? This is all the chemical. We see everything beautifully when when you stimulate the right brain function. And we think everything's horrible when you stimulate other brain functions. But this is all subject to those combinations, not to something that we can control at that service level. We have no power at all if we blame the trigger. If I say, oh, well, I have seasonal depression, it's just who I am, I'm giving all my power to the weather, to the amount of light in the sky. But on the other hand, we can't address the trigger itself, right? I can't control this season. I can't control the sensory information of light. I can't go through or even consciously ever learn all of the triggers I have. That's not possible. And I also can't control them. To try and control them is exhausting. It's painful. Many of us have tried to do that. I think about someone I know who she expected everyone else to accommodate her trigger. So she would say, well, you can't say that triggers me, or don't act like that triggers me. And it's not her fault she's doing this. She just doesn't know another way to do it. The problem with doing this is with 7.5 billion people on the planet, it is impossible to control the sensory trigger. It's impossible to figure out and make everybody accommodate. And to do it, to try and control the sensory information that's coming in, we must, if we're going to do it that way, we must make our world smaller and smaller. We must let less and less people into it, because the more people we have, the more likely we are to get triggered. And what happens is we make our world so small that eventually the only thing it can contain is us. And we become a prisoner of our own fear. And I think a lot of people have experienced this. I think a lot of people with social anxiety experience this at a deep level, right? Where they maybe have they talk about agoraphobia is a fear of fear, that maybe you go to a mall and have a sensory trigger. And so then it's like, oh, well, I can't go to malls anymore. And then it happens in the grocery store. And now I can't go to grocery stores anymore. And that happens down the street at the neighbor's house. And I can't go down the street to the neighbor's house anymore. And so what happens is we systematically put ourselves in a box of our own misery, because we're trying not to be in pain, we're trying not to be in fear. And so trying to control the sensory information is established. It really is impossible. But trying to control the memory is equally impossible. So when we're talking about memory, right, there are these 3 types of memory. And so when we're looking at memory, so if we're thinking, okay, I can't control the sensory thing, and if the combination of sensory and memory create the trigger, why wouldn't I use memory? And some systems do, like therapeutic processes go back and process the memory. But let's talk about memory for a minute, and why that can't always work, and why well, we know it can be excruciating. If we've had traumatic experiences and we go through a therapeutic process of let's talk about the experience, we don't want to keep revisiting that memory. It's painful. We're re-traumatizing ourselves. But it also there's another fundamental risk in it, or potential flaw, and that is that so there are 3 types of memory, right? We have personal experience. So I want to dig into that a little bit. This is what we've experienced. So for example, like trauma. If I almost drowned as a child, I know I have a personal experience of trauma, of almost drowning, and I might have a fear of water. that's a personal experience. And in therapeutic process, I can go back and I can talk about water, and maybe I can do some exposure therapy, or I can talk about all the other things that could occur with water. There are a lot of ways to approach it. One of the problems is also when we have this with positive triggers, it can lead to disappointment. So now if we're going to say, okay, well, it's the memory, for example, brownies. I may love brownies, and if I smell brownies, I think, oh, I'm going to get a brownie. And then this one particular brownie I tried may not taste so good. So now all of a sudden I'm disappointed. So counting on those issues, counting on those memories becomes kind of a setup. But the even bigger issue is the other types of memory. So if we start to look at something like primal memory, for example, fear of spiders or snakes or fear of the dark, I for the majority of my life had what is known as the most common unknown phobia. And this phobia is called trypophobia. Trypophobia is a visual phobia. So when you see irregular clusters of patterns, like seed pods, or it might be certain types of bark on a tree or something like that. There's an issue of the brain reacting, and it's a really very visceral reaction that's like, for me, I couldn't even look at it. I would just shiver if I saw these. But I didn't know what it was until I learned about trypophobia. Now, trypophobia, like fear of spiders or snakes, fear of heights or the dark, these are primal fears that have been encoded in our DNA over centuries, millennia of existence. And so we've known our predators. Spiders and snakes can be poisonous, so that makes sense. Also, they believe trypophobia is the surface of poisonous animals or plants, often has that kind of scaly, pitted structure, and so reacting to that. Also, I think that a lot of times when you have holes like seed pods and stuff, maybe spiders crawl out of those or other bugs, and so the brain sees that visual pattern and says, no, something could crawl out of there, or that's a texture. The concept of decaying skin, if it's too close, if you have this poisonous animal or somebody with decaying skin too close to you, your brain is saying, oh, that puts you at risk, and so it's trying to help you, saying back away from that. Of course, a picture of a trypophobic image is not really going to harm me, and it's triggering me, which means it's doing damage to my body. The problem is if I'm trying to process memory, I have no memory to process. This is true with a lot of people that have social anxiety. A lot of people that have social anxiety have never had a social trauma. They adopted it from a parent that had social anxiety, or they were overprotected as a child and taught to fear the world. And when we have things like this, we may not, if it is a genetically passed thing like social anxiety, or even for me, like there was self-loathing and panic disorder that were adopted. I had them my whole life, and so I didn't have a specific memory to process. I could attach it to memories, but that wasn't the real cause. Then there's also a third kind of memory, which is the environment. Not all conscious memories can be recalled. So, for example, the temperature, the weather, electromagnetic fields are really interesting in the fact that old electrical boxes, people that have those, a lot of paranormal experiences that people have been attributed to EMF fields. And so what an EMF field is an electromagnetic field that is unsafe. So in old homes that have these old electrical boxes, sometimes people will develop paranoia, hallucination, feeling like they're being watched. All of these feelings are a sensory response. So the brain is taking up in the electromagnetic field, it's sensing that, and then it's combining with an old stored memory that this is not safe. Electromagnetic fields can kill us if we're exposed for too long. And so it's having this reaction, but there's no way for us to measure that. So in that, we kind of established that we can't control the senses. We can't control the memory, and we can't even control the trigger itself. And this is where we've gone wrong a lot. As we've come to know this information about the brain, is we've trying to control all these things. There are a lot of programs saying, okay, learn how to control your thoughts or control your moods, think positively, or have better boundaries, or there's all these different things that we're addressing. But I think the error in that is we're addressing the outcome of it. Instead of doing that, or even instead of trying to address the trigger, what we want to do is we want to create a brain that has a mild reaction or a mild trigger reaction, so that if I do trigger, I'm not having an extreme. So if you could reduce the experience of the trigger, most of us want this. This is what most of the world's talking about and promising, right? Be more conscious, be less reactive, be less emotional, be calmer, more peaceful, have emotional intelligence, be happier, be healthier. These are all the things we strive for. But instead of trying to force ourselves to do that, what's important is that we make the reactive or triggering part of the brain less prevalent, so that we can be free of anxiety or PTSD or depression, because this is our real goal. And what we know from the program, and again, it's in that free class, whether you go on YouTube or onto our website, we know now, science knows, neuroscience has established this. To reduce the impact of negative triggers, we must shrink the amygdala, so to have less confirmation bias, less stress. If the amygdala shrinks, we have less fear and less reaction. And the other thing that we know on the other end of the spectrum, when you look at the educational sciences, is that when we trigger the prefrontal cortex, which they're doing to help us learn better, you will hear a common thing out in the world, and that is that stress and fear and all these fight or flight responses are triggered to the amygdala activating. You will hear another common thing. You will hear that the amygdala, when the amygdala activates, it shuts off the prefrontal cortex. It's why you don't have new thought. You're just reacting according to training. Conversely, we know that if you trigger the prefrontal cortex, then the amygdala shuts off. So it's kind of like you're in a learning state now. You're in an observational state. And so that you're no longer having that concept of being chased by a tiger. And so when we trigger the prefrontal cortex, it makes us calmer and more centered. This is what mindfulness is all about. What mindful means is observational. So it means just being in an observational state is a mindful state. And staying in this state, neuroscience has studied it, for 5 weeks doing a truly mindful practice. We're all still learning how to be mindful, but doing that for 5 weeks in a row visibly shrinks the amygdala. And so that's what we want to do. If instead of trying to address the trigger or pull apart the trigger or even understand it or blame it, instead of blaming the boss or the relationship or the weather, instead what we can do is we can trigger that prefrontal cortex and reduce our reaction to that. So ways to do that, there are a lot of options out there. This is commonly understood. This is early in our program, so this is information that's everywhere. So you can check out our class and look up phase 2 practices. So there is a video on YouTube. I think it's like class number 4 or 5, something like that, and might even be 6. Sorry. But if you go on YouTube and look for the one with the symbol that says phase 2 practices, there's a list of practices on there. If you take the class, I actually give you a list in there, or if you go to our online store at theinspiredevolutionproject.com, there are sheets that give some suggested practices. Just go and go onto the store and look for phase 2 practice logs, I think is what it's called. It's free. It does come from our store, but it's a free download. But that'll give you a bunch of practices as well as a journal to track them with. The other thing you could do is look online. There are so many phase 2 practices available. or prefrontal cortex triggers. Just type in prefrontal cortex and you will get a lot of options. Try a lot of different things. The same thing doesn't work for everybody. So if it doesn't work for you, if it doesn't make you feel better, try something else. And understand, even if it works for a while, you may need to come up with something new after a while as your brain gets more adept at it. But there's a lot more information on the class about that. There will also be more in our private group. I will be doing an extended video of this. For right now, that private group is free on Meetup, the Inspired Evolution Project. Go on to Google and search Inspired Evolution Project Meetup. If you look on Meetup, you may not find it. I don't know, their search engine isn't very good. But if you do go on and type into Google Inspired Evolution Project Meetup, we should be the first several pages. That group will be free till the 15th, but it has these extended videos. After the 15th, it'll be a paid private group, but it's going to have a ton of content. This is where I'm going to go to give people all this extra information. So on Wednesday, there will be an extension on this video. If you have any questions, put in comments. I am happy to answer whatever I can. And however you decide to move forward, I wish you tremendous success on your journey. And I am grateful. Thank you for joining me today. And I will see you next Monday for another brain hack video, or maybe even Thursday for the live meditation Thursday night at 7 p.m. Again, I hope everyone has a fantastic day.